The latest round of purges, as it were, started in January. Zhang Youxia just didn't appear in the meetings that he was meant to. The PLA itself announced that actually he is under investigation for corruption. They are the most senior military men in China. The PLA has not had any fighting experience in almost half a century. There is a ticking time bomb in the sense of his own legacy. He probably does want to be the leader who sorts something out with Taiwan. Who is there now to advise him on important issues? American intelligence thinks Xi is becoming quite paranoid.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Cindy Yu, columnist and contributing editor at The Times and Sunday Times. Welcome, Cindy.
Hi, Fraser.
See, there's really no one I'd rather talk to at the moment about China, because while a lot of the world's attention has been focused, understandably, following Donald Trump's antics in Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, etc., actually quite a lot has been going on in China that people may have missed. And most significantly, there has been a huge purge of senior military figures. Cindy, I wonder if you could just, first of all, tell us what happened and explain why this is so significant within China.
Sure. So the latest round of purges, as it were, started in January, mid-January. Suddenly, Xi's most senior advisor on that, Zhang Youxia, basically just didn't appear in the meetings that he was meant to. And there were rumors of arrests, and as there always is, but you never really know what's happened. Then about a week later, the PLA itself announced that actually he is under investigation for corruption, along with the Chief of Staff of the Central Military Commission as well. So just brief bit of background here. The Central Military Commission basically looks after the PLA and all areas of China's military forces. And the PLA is a party army, not a country's army. So there's not a defense department per se. The Central Military Commission basically is the party organ that controls this party army. But they are the most senior military men in China. And now on that commission, there were 7 people at the end of 2022. Now there are only 2. Xi Jinping and one other person, the director of investigations on that. The other 5 men have all been successively purged basically since 2022. It is incredible to have that commission so unmanned. And in this particular case in January, the purge of Zhang Youxia, because he was such a close advisor, or at least we thought from the outside, to see, it was quite a shocking development as well. He was slightly older, he was past his retirement age, so people thought maybe that's why he was being kept on, because he was so trusted by Xi. He'd known Xi since they were both children. Their fathers had fought together in the Chinese Civil War. So this is a real shock moment, and there are all sorts of things you can basically read from that. We are on the outside a bit, none the wiser.
And he was a war hero as well, is that right, to the Chinese, having actually one of the few people with war experience?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is the underrated thing about the PLA, is actually that it's not had any fighting experience in almost half a century. The last war it was involved in was Vietnam, and Zhang Youxia was someone who was on the battlefield then. And so, compared to Xi and the director of investigations left on the commission, there's basically no other people with fighting experience at that senior level. Now, some commentators have said that kind of gave Zhang a sort of feeling of war is not something to go easily into. And so perhaps he was advising Xi against going to Taiwan or something like that. Or it could just be that in a war scenario that they don't have any actual top level experience when it comes to these commanders. So yeah, pretty turbulent times.
I'll definitely come to Taiwan in a second, but a lot of China watchers are debating as to whether this is a sign of strength from President Xi or a sign of weakness and perhaps paranoia. What would you say are the arguments on either side? And I'd be thrilled to get your own take as well, if possible, although I appreciate that it is really, really impossible to be able to say anything definitively.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of setting out the arguments for both sides, because I think that's the easiest way to do this for now. The side that says, this is Xi being strong, he is doing this for good reason. You look at the charges laid against Zhang Youxia are corruption, basically. And over the last few years of purges, all of the charges have been corruption related. And actually, all of the people who have been purged have been related to the procurement program in the PLA as well. A few years ago, there was a report from American intelligence that actually actually the PLA had found that some of its missile silos didn't open properly. Some of its missiles themselves were filled with water rather than with fuel. All of this sort of stuff, so which raises questions about how deep does the rot go in the PLA, and in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well, where corruption is widespread in the Russian army. That wasn't clear until after they were on the battleground. I'm sure that's kind of raised questions and raised scrutiny back home in China as well, to say, well, how battle ready is our force? So, the strong argument is that these men are guilty. They were guilty of corruption. They have been, embezzling or procuring the wrong things or whatever it is. And so Xi had to root them out. And the fact that he can do so without a massive backlash, is a sign of strength. So that's one side of the argument. I mean, the other side is that this is someone who you've known for decades. This is someone whose father was a party loyalist along with your own father, who is way past the retirement age. If you didn't think he was doing a good job, and let's say the corruption charges have been trumped up, you could just let him retire. You did not have to purge him. You did not have to ruin his reputation. There are actually reports, the Wall Street Journal reported that the internal party briefing, at least that they want the Wall Street Journal to know about, is that Zhang Youxia actually leaked nuclear secrets to the Americans. I mean, that's pretty unlikely. In that kind of environment that he got away with that, that's pretty unlikely. And if he really did do something like that, I think we would expect way more than just an arrest and imprisonment. This is the ultimate treason, really. And so, if it's not corruption and if it's not nuclear secrets, such a close ally, someone with battleground experience, why has she got rid of him? And that's the paranoia side of things. And this is something that the New York Times recently reported, that American intelligence is coming to the conclusion of, that actually that they think Xi is becoming quite paranoid. And it raises particularly, whichever way you look at it, it raises particularly the question of who is there now to advise him on important issues. All of the people around him have either been retired or left themselves or purged. There are very few old hands who are still around, which, even if he's not paranoid before, it's not a great environment for an aging leader to be going into anyway. So I think, if you want like a stable way of governance, this is probably not the most likely way to get there.
And are there other factors that might potentially be weakening Xi Jinping? Because from the outside, it looks as if the Chinese economy is still performing healthily. He appears to be an iron leader from the outside. Are there any factors that might cast doubt on that position?
Well, the economy is doing good on headline figures. They allegedly hit 5% economic growth last year. If you give or take some massaging of the figures, there will still have been growth. But when you dig deep into where that growth came from, it mainly came from exports. And actually, they got Trump to thank for that, because the tariff war, because it was so global, it meant that Chinese exports, even though they fell to America, have increased when it comes to Chinese exports to Europe, to Latin America, to Southeast Asia as well. And so exports have really been the main thing pulling the Chinese economy along in the last year. But actually, when you look at domestic consumption, imports, that kind of stuff, it actually is still looking quite dire. So economically, the country's not in a massively great place. I guess I would also raise the fact that Xi himself is aging. Of course, he's, what is it now? He's in position now for almost 15 years. And he could take another 5-year term. I mean, terms don't really mean anything anymore anyway, but the party congresses do kind of outline each 5-year term, so he could do another one of those. But if he's not worried about what comes after him, I'd be very, very surprised about that. Maybe that organ donation thing that he and Putin were talking about is much further along than any of us think, but I think that's like a ticking clock for him. But otherwise, it does look pretty good, geopolitically on a global stage. What Trump has done in the last month, and in particular, throughout the last year, but in particular in the last month, has just played into Xi's hands so well. You see the succession of Western leaders going to China because Trump is pushing them away and making these leaders think about hedging, and China is just there to kind of take advantage from the sidelines. And actually, similarly for Taiwan, I've just written my column on this one about how Taiwan's own internal politics is constantly flirting with getting closer to China as well. So, it's looking a pretty good hand for now. There are obviously, tricky bits, but it's looking like a relatively good hand.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to come on to, because clearly, if you look at America's national security strategy, despite the fact that Trump seems to be veering from place to place. Actually, of course, China and containing China is absolutely at the heart of it. But from what you're suggesting, already this is not having much success and in fact actually backfiring.
Yeah, I mean, they're doing it in a very American first way, aren't they? And that's very different to how Biden had been doing it, which is uniting the West. Even Liz Truss talked about, what was it, an alliance of democracies, of a network of democracy. I can't remember exactly the phrase that Liz Truss used. But basically the idea is to use this multilateral links with other like-minded powers to tackle China together. Trump's America doesn't want to do that. In some ways, they're more irritated by Europe than they are by China, at least when it comes to some of the culture wars stuff, which the national security strategy had as much about as China. And so, yeah, I mean, by pushing their allies away, I think America is limiting how influential it can be. There's interesting developments there. For example, this week, DC is hosting a critical minerals meeting with European leaders as well as with American leaders to say, how can we diversify? So that's still multilateral and that's kind of stuff is still good. But, the big picture really is pushing countries that would very much otherwise like to lean America's way away from America. And inherently in that, if China can peel anyone away from America, even if they're not pro-China, it's still a relatively good thing to happen.
And I wanted to come on to Taiwan as well, because you mentioned that this purge may have implications for that. If people with military experience are reluctant to invade, does that suggest that perhaps Xi might be a bit more gung-ho? Is there pressure on him to invade, to reunite China as they would see it?
I mean, certainly the number that's the year that's often thrown around is 2027. That's what American intelligence has said that Xi has internally set a deadline for in terms of being ready to invade Taiwan. Now, that's a figure that actually, it does raise a lot of questions because actually is not sourced anywhere other than what American intelligence itself is saying. And when I spoke to a PLA former colonel a couple of months ago, and he said, well, what does it mean to be ready? Because weaponry is all constantly getting better. The battlefield calculus is constantly changing with new technology like drones, for example, which totally kind of upend what we think is the meaning of hard power and resources. So there is no such thing as being ready full stop. You constantly have to be kind of increasing your own side and in relative to the other side. So he was very skeptical of that. But I think, it would be unlikely for Xi to be setting himself a deadline of 2027 anyway, because he wouldn't want to rod for his own back. But I think there is a ticking time bomb in the sense of his own legacy. He probably does want to be the leader who sorts something out with Taiwan, even, if that's not military action and that's a peaceful unification. So I think, yeah, we will see, as he gets closer to the end of his time in power, to the end of his life, does he start to become a bit more impatient, a bit more anxious? Mao triggered a cultural revolution when he was nearing the end of his life. We just don't know what's going to happen there. But certainly domestically, it's underrated how much that China would actually just prefer to keep the status quo, to have Taiwan say, not reject the idea of coming back to China, but just to say, yeah, maybe one day. That actually would help them quite a lot, because otherwise it becomes a question of how can you do it, how can you invade them, how can you successfully do it without a massive backlash to the economy and to the party itself. And all of that actually creates a lot of problems as well. So in some ways, Taiwan has to play it very carefully by not totally shutting that road off to the Chinese, so that they think the only way we can get Taiwan is through invasion, but also at the same time protecting their own independence as well.
And finally, I wanted to ask you about the UK. Keir Starmer has just come back from a trip to China, and we've just opened a Chinese embassy, agreed to open a brand new Chinese embassy. I wonder if you get the sense that the British government and public debate and politicians seem to veer between two equally unsustainable poles, where we'll go from the golden age of China to complete frostiness with China, relentless bashing of China, and now we seem to be back onto the golden age redux. Is there maybe a more sensible way to deal with China that preserves our interests, preserves our security, but also doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, doesn't risk economic harms, for instance? And are any politicians really getting that right?
Well, I think there is a way to do it, but it's going to have to be an iterative process. You're going to be to use Deng Xiaoping's phrase, crossing the river by feeling for stones. You're figuring it out as you go, basically. It's hard to do a blueprint from the beginning. But I think there is a way to kind of think about what your priorities are. So, for example, in the UK, perhaps that's critical infrastructure. Chinese investment used to be involved in nuclear, involved in things like telecoms, as we know from Huawei, all of that sort of stuff where you think if the Chinese pull the plug, how much of a problem would that be for us? So that's, I think, one thing I would think about is just, are you overly reliant for your critical infrastructure? God forbid, in a war scenario, could Beijing just kind of totally disrupt your society? And that's the kind of thing we have to prevent against. And then I think beyond that, there are, of course, other concerns like surveillance, transnational oppression, things like that we also have to think about. But I would put those more in kind of like an amber area if the critical infrastructure is a red area. Then in the greens, I think, is other stuff that we can kind of trade on, cooperate on. For example, financial services. In terms of the UK, we actually have a services surplus with China. Even though we have an overall trade deficit, the surplus is actually about £10 billion. So, are there safe ways to expand that? And then other things that we can import from China that's like, basically fine in the sense of like, I guess like less high tech things like clothes or whatever it is. Or are there Chinese investments that could come over here that could actually spur into jobs as well? That would also be beneficial instead of just kind of importing pre-made goods. So all of those things I think are probably in the realm of better things. Where the specific lines lie, I think, the UK will have to think about it a bit more. And I was hoping the Labour government would do that in the China audit. They then, in the end, never published that. From this trip, I think they have been thinking about it in these senses, because actually the delegation that did go are mainly services people or premium goods that the UK can export over, or biotech as well, which is one big thing that the UK is good at. The AstraZeneca deal is not actually a joint venture with the Chinese. It's more like a licensing deal so that AstraZeneca can sell the Chinese drugs that are being tested inside China at the moment. So all of that stuff is very promising. And I'm personally quite sympathetic to the trip in the sense of, he came back and people said, is that it? I don't think the point of the trip is to get loads and loads of stuff, because actually that would have made the British economy more reliant on Chinese economy again anyway, and we don't want that. The point is just to normalize that kind of country-to-country relationship so that in the future, it's not another 8 years before the Prime Minister goes again, so that you just kind of start having a normalish relationship with China in the way that other countries do. And of course, there are concerns about espionage and human rights and all sorts of stuff. But it's just about having a mature foreign policy that recognizes that actually you don't control all the countries in the world. People do lots of things that you don't like. Just because you deal with Trump doesn't mean you condone ISIS actions, for example, or Saudi Arabia, you don't condone the killing of journalists there. Frankly, the world is an imperfect and dirty place. And so it's just about kind of what's in the British interest within that as well. And so I think that those must be the guiding principles to a good China policy. I think Keir Starmer's government is actually doing okay on that. Of course, the whole Peter Mandelson thing threatens to topple them from inside, but in a way that's unrelated to foreign policy per se.
Cindy, thank you very much.
Thank you.